They say love shows up when you least expect it. But what if it shows up when you're holding a fern under your arm and a cup of coffee in your hand? This is the story of an impossible encounter that turned into destiny. And it's going to make you believe in love again, even in the middle of chaos and chance. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, turn on the notification bell, and help this video gain hype so this story can reach even more hearts. The morning began like every other at Clover and Steam, with the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling every corner of the cafe, steam dancing lazily through the crisp New York air, and Sandra balancing 3 cups on a tray while trying not to trip over her own feet. Spoiler alert, she tripped. She didn't fall, but she tripped, just enough to make the tray wobble dangerously, and one of the customers give her that look that said, "Should I have just ordered this to go? Everything's fine. All under control," Sandra announced with a bright smile, setting the cups down on the table with the delicacy of someone who had just defused a bomb. The customer nodded, clearly unconvinced, but grateful that his coffee was still in the cup and not in his lap. Sandra was 26 and had an impressive talent for turning simple situations into small, memorable disasters, not because she was incompetent, but because she suffered from a dangerous combination of chronic distraction and excessive enthusiasm for life. She was the kind of person who tripped on flat sidewalks, waved cheerfully at strangers thinking they were acquaintances, and always chose the checkout line where the card machine decided to have an existential crisis. But there was something irresistibly charming about all that. Maybe it was the way she laughed at her own clumsiness, or the way she apologized with such genuine sincerity that it was impossible to stay mad at her. Sandra had that kind of energy that lit up a room, even when she was literally knocking things over. Clover and Steam was a cozy refuge in the middle of Manhattan's chaos. Exposed brick walls, hanging plants that Sandra insisted on rescuing from stores that were about to throw them away, and vintage lamps that gave the place a warm, slightly nostalgic glow. It was the kind of cafe that showed up in romantic movies as the backdrop for unlikely encounters, and Sandra secretly loved to believe that life might someday imitate art. "You spilled foam on the counter again," Marin observed, not even looking up from her phone, where she was watching an episode of her favorite crime series on the lowest volume, earbuds hanging from her neck like a permanent necklace. "I didn't spill it. It was creative excess," Sandra replied, wiping the counter with a cloth that had clearly seen better days. Marin raised an eyebrow. She was 31, her short hair perfectly messy on purpose, and she had an impressive ability to state inconvenient truths with the subtlety of a hammer. They had worked together for 4 years, and in that time Marin had become not just Sandra's best friend, but also her anchor to reality, the person who pulled her back to earth whenever Sandra's romantic fantasies started to float too high. "Creative excess," Marin repeated, savoring each syllable as if tasting a questionable wine. "Is that what you call forgetting to close the espresso valve again? I prefer to see it as an opportunity to practice mindful cleaning. You're terrible, and you adore me for it." Marin rolled her eyes, but the corner of her mouth betrayed a smile. It was impossible not to like Sandra, even when she turned the cafe into an episode of accidental physical comedy. The rest of the morning went by in the usual rhythm, customers ordering oat milk lattes, double cappuccinos, and sugar-free Americanos. Sandra served everyone with that genuine enthusiasm that made people come back, not just for the coffee, but for the feeling of being truly seen. She remembered names, asked about kids, dogs, vacations. She had an incredible emotional memory, even if her memory for locking her apartment door was questionable. Around 11 a.m., when business slowed for a bit, Sandra was trying to rescue a plant that was drooping dramatically from its pot, as if performing a slow-motion farewell. "That one's done for," Marin said, walking by with a tray of croissants. "Accept it. She's chosen the light. Plants don't die, they just go into extended hibernation. That's botanical denial. It's sustainable optimism," Sandra corrected, adjusting the wilted fern with the tenderness of someone caring for a newborn. "San, you've already killed 3 cacti this year." Cacti, the plant that survives in the desert. "You managed to kill vegetation that evolved to withstand extreme conditions." Sandra paused. thinking it over. Okay, that's impressive and in a terribly tragic way. It was a silent massacre. You're being dramatic. I'm being realistic. You have the hands of a plant serial killer. Sandra threw a dish towel at her, which Maren dodged with the reflexes of someone who had long since learned to expect it. By mid-afternoon, when the rush slowed again, Sandra was rearranging plants in the window display when Maren approached with 2 mugs of tea. Mandatory break. Sit down. Before you fall and sue us for a workplace injury. Sandra accepted the mug and collapsed into a chair with a theatrical sigh. You know what I was thinking? No. And I'm already mentally calling my lawyer. I'm 26 and I still haven't lived a movie-worthy romance. Maren nearly spat out her tea. Sandra, you literally knocked a guy over on the street last week because you were staring at a pigeon that looked sad. But he wasn't the guy. He was just a guy. Angry. In an eye. Expensive suit that I ruined. You have very specific standards for someone who trips on air. Sandra laughed, but there was a trace of melancholy hidden behind the humor. The truth was she believed in love. The old-fashioned kind. Improbable. Unexpected. The kind that appeared out of nowhere and changed everything. Her parents had met in a movie theater line, fought over the last popcorn and got married 8 months later. They'd been together for 32 years. Sandra grew up, believing that love was like that. Unexpected, chaotic, and true. The problem was that real life seemed to have other plans. Her last relationship had ended 6 months ago, when Michael decided he needed to find himself, a poetic euphemism for, I met someone else. It hurt, of course, but the truth was Sandra had already suspected they were just filling each other's empty spaces without really connecting. I just want, you know, a kind of date you remember forever. Something real. Maren looked at her for a long moment, her expression softening. You'll find it, San. But maybe you need to stop looking so hard and let life surprise you. But what if life's too busy surprising other people? Then you'll go after it and bump into it. Literally. Knowing you, you'll spill something in the process. Sandra smiled. That crooked little smile she gave when she pretended to agree, but secretly planned to do exactly what she wanted anyway. Or maybe, she said, raising her mug in a mock toast. I just need to take the subway more often. Maren frowned. What does the subway have to do with this? I don't know. More people. More possibilities. More fate. You watch too many movies. Impossible. And too many airport romances. Also impossible. Maren sighed, but there was affection in it. When you meet this hypothetical guy who can handle your disasters, I'm calling dibs on maid of honor. Just saying. Deal. But you'll have to wear a dress. Negotiable. Maren. Very negotiable. And as the lazy afternoon light stretched through the windows of Clover and Steam, Sandra went back to work carrying that stubborn hope that refused to die, even after all the stumbles, spills, and near disasters. Maren watched her for a moment, shaking her head with a knowing smile. Sandra was incorrigible, but that was exactly why she loved her. Because if there was one thing Sandra had in abundance, it was faith. Faith that something extraordinary was still on its way. She just didn't know that something would wear a white coat and had completely forgotten how to smile. Across town, in a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and life-or-death decisions, Conrad was having the kind of day that made anyone question their career choices. He had just stepped out of a 7-hour surgery. Successful, technically, but his exhaustion wasn't only physical. It was the kind that seeped into the bones. The mind, the soul. The kind that made you wonder if saving lives still meant anything when you couldn't save them all. Conrad was 38 and had an impeccable reputation. Dr. Foster was the kind of doctor other doctors recommended, the name cited in medical journals, the man you wanted in the operating room if it was your heart on the table. But lately, he felt like a fraud, not because he lacked skill, he didn't, and he knew that, but because all that skill felt hollow when he came home to nothing but silence. His relationship with Vanessa had ended 8 months ago. 5 years together evaporated in a polite, painfully civil conversation at an Italian restaurant he now avoided like it was radioactive. She wanted more. He was always at the hospital. She needed someone present. He was present, just never there. It was fair. It was understandable. It was devastating. And then, 3 weeks ago, he lost a patient. It happened. Conrad knew that. It was part Medicine, part of life. But this one was different. A 42-year-old man, 2 children, a wife pregnant with their third. Conrad had done everything right. Technically, he had done everything right. But it hadn't been enough. And when he had to walk out of that operating room and tell that woman her husband hadn't made it, something inside him cracked. Since then, he'd been running on autopilot. Wake up, hospital, surgeries, reports, meetings, go home, sleep a few hours, repeat. Life had turned into a mechanical sequence of obligations, and Conrad no longer knew where the man had gone, the one who'd once chosen medicine because he wanted to make a difference. "You've got that face again," said Glenn, appearing beside him in the hallway like an annoyingly observant cat. Conrad didn't even bother asking which face. "I'm tired, Glenn. You're always tired. But today you've got the, I'm questioning my entire existence face. That's different." Glenn Dungy was a surgeon, Conrad's colleague for over a decade, and owner of a sense of humor that bordered on inappropriate, especially in a hospital. But he was also one of the few people Conrad truly considered a friend, someone who knew him well enough to tell when to push and when to back off. "I'm fine," Conrad lied. "Badly. Sure, and I'm the next Surgeon General. Look, I know last month was rough, but you've got to step out of this bubble, Conrad. When was the last time you did anything? Other than work and sleep?" Conrad considered the question. When had it been, really? "I went to the grocery store last week. That doesn't count. Eating is basic survival. I'm talking about something that reminds you you're a human being, not just a walking scalpel. So what do you suggest?" Glenn folded his arms, thoughtful. "A bar, a restaurant, a walk. Anything that reminds you there's life outside these depressing white walls." Conrad almost smiled. Almost. "I'll think about it." "No, you won't. You'll go home, heat up something frozen in the microwave, watch half an episode of some show while reviewing patient charts, and pass out on the couch before midnight. I know because that's what you do every day." The accuracy was unsettling. "You should worry more about your own life." "My life's great, thanks. But yours is turning into one of those depressing medical documentaries no one finishes watching." Conrad sighed. Glenn was right, of course. He always was. But knowing that and actually doing something about it were two entirely different things. "Listen," Glenn continued, his tone softening. "I know you lost that patient. I know the breakup still stings. But you're punishing yourself, and that's not helping anyone. Least of all you." Conrad looked down the hallway. Those same cold white walls he'd walked past every day for the last 15 years. When he'd started in medicine, everything had felt so clear. There was purpose, passion, that sense that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Now all he felt was a deep fatigue, and the gnawing doubt of whether he was still making a difference or just running on inertia. "I just need some time," Conrad admitted finally. His voice came out lower than he intended. "Then take a vacation. A week, a few days, anything." "I can't. My schedule's packed. It always is, and it always will be. The question is, are you going to wait until you burn out completely, or do something before that happens?" Conrad didn't answer, because he didn't have one. His shift ended 2 hours later, and he found himself standing in the hospital parking lot, staring at his car as if it belonged to someone else. A gray sedan, clean, functional, safe, exactly like his life had become, functional and utterly colorless. He got in, started the engine, and sat there for a long moment, hands on the wheel, exhaustion pressing on his shoulders like a physical weight. The thought of facing traffic, going back to an empty apartment, repeating the same routine, it was draining just to imagine. That was when his gaze landed on a billboard nearby. "Rediscover New York. Take the subway." Conrad hadn't taken the subway in years. Not since he'd bought the car, actually. It was faster, more practical, more controlled. But maybe that was exactly the problem. Maybe his life had become too controlled, too predictable, too safe, to the point of suffocating any chance of surprise. He looked at the dashboard, then at the billboard, then back at the wheel. And then, in a completely uncharacteristic impulse, he turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, and started walking toward the nearest subway station. Maybe Glenn was right. Maybe he needed to step out of the bubble. Maybe a little unpredictability was exactly what he needed. What Conrad didn't know, in that moment, was that unpredictability was already on its way, in the form of a woman holding a cup of coffee, a plant tucked under her arm, and an impressive talent for turning his life completely upside down. But he was about to find out. The New York subway had a peculiar scent that Conrad had completely forgotten, a mix of heated metal, clashing perfumes, and something indefinable that only made sense underground in a metropolis. He descended the station steps with the strange feeling of visiting a familiar place that had somehow become foreign. The platform was moderately crowded for late afternoon. People wearing headphones, each sealed inside their own worlds. A street musician played something that might have been jazz, or just ambitious improvisation. The distant rumble of an approaching train echoed through the tunnel like subterranean thunder. Conrad stood near the yellow safety line, hands in his overcoat pockets, observing the movement around him with the detached curiosity of someone who was there, but not entirely present. Part of him still couldn't believe he'd left his car in the parking lot purely on impulse. Impulses hadn't been part of his vocabulary for years, and yet here he was, about to step into a crowded subway car for no logical reason other than, what? Seeking something different? Running away from routine? The train arrived with a metallic screech. The doors opened, and Conrad stepped in with the small wave of commuters. He found a spot standing near the door, holding the overhead rail, letting his body sway slightly with the rhythm of the car. There was something strangely meditative about it. The rhythmic motion, the white noise of nearby conversations, the sense of being carried somewhere without having to decide anything. Maybe Glenn had been right. Maybe he really did need this to leave his controlled bubble, let go a little, stop managing every detail of his existence as if it were open-heart surgery. 3 stops later, Conrad was almost relaxed as he could be these days, when he heard a familiar sound. Someone saying "excuse me" with the rushed politeness of a person clearly running late. He turned instinctively and saw her. A woman was trying to squeeze through the small crowd, juggling an utterly illogical combination of items. A large handbag slung over one shoulder, a to-go cup of coffee in her right hand, and, for heaven's sake, a plant, a fern to be exact, whose leaves looked like they'd seen better days. She moved with chaotic determination, murmuring apologies to every person she brushed past, the coffee sloshing dangerously with every step. Conrad watched, fascinated and mildly alarmed, as she approached, clearly aiming for the door before the train reached the next station. And then it happened. The train jerked to an abrupt stop, nothing extraordinary by New York standards, but enough to throw off anyone unprepared. The woman stumbled. The plant slipped from under her arm, and as she tried to save both it and the coffee, she collided straight into Conrad. The coffee, of course, did not survive. Conrad felt the hot liquid seep through his shirt, spreading across his chest in a brown stain that definitely wouldn't come out without professional dry cleaning. He looked down, processing what had just happened, then lifted his gaze to meet the most mortified expression he had ever seen in his life. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." The woman began, already rummaging through her bag for something to contain the disaster. She pulled out a napkin, which Conrad noted with a mix of horror and amusement, had clearly been used. There was a pink lipstick mark on one corner. "Wait, no, not that one," she muttered to herself, tossing the napkin back into her bag with frantic energy. "I have a clean one, I swear. I always have." The plant chose that exact moment to slip again, and she pinned it to her side with her elbow, while digging through her bag with one hand and holding the now empty cup with the other. An impressive display of doomed multitasking. Conrad should have been annoyed. Logically, anyone would be. It was an expensive shirt. He was exhausted, and now he'd have to go home soaked in cold coffee. But as he watched this woman fighting against her own bag, her plant, and her existence itself, something entirely unexpected happened. He laughed. Not a polite smile, not a restrained chuckle. A genuine laugh, the kind that started deep in his chest and rose before he could stop it. It was short, a little rusty, as if his facial muscles had forgotten how to move that way. But it was real. The woman froze mid-motion and looked up at him, startled. "You're laughing?" "Apparently," Conrad replied, and even his own voice sounded strange, lighter than it had in weeks. She blinked, processing, and then something shifted on her face. The mortification faded, replaced by visible relief, followed by a shy yet genuinely captivating smile. "So you're not going to sue me?" "Not in my immediate plans. Thank God, because I definitely can't afford a lawyer. I can barely afford this plant," she confessed, glancing down at the fern as if it were a troublesome child, which, by the way, is dying. "But I promised to save it, so here we are." Conrad found himself smiling again. When was the last time he'd smiled twice in under a minute? "You're transporting a dying plant on the subway. Judge not, unless you've personally rescued vegetation in distress," she shot back, a playful spark lighting her eyes, one that was impossible to ignore. "Fair enough." The train announced the next stop, and the woman looked toward the door with urgency. "This is my stop. I'm really sorry about the coffee, and the shirt, and the general situation," she said, already moving toward the exit, still balancing the plant and her bag. "It's all right," Conrad heard himself say, and realized he truly meant it. She smiled once more, that kind of smile that lit up her entire face, and then vanished into the crowd on the platform, the fern swaying above her head like a tragic little flag. The doors closed, the train moved on, and Conrad stood there, coffee soaking through his shirt, feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time: lightness. Sandra could barely breathe when she came out of the station, not from the rush, but from a toxic mix of embarrassment and confusion that burned inside her. Something strange and bubbling that made her stomach twist in ways that had nothing to do with running. She had spilled coffee on a complete stranger. Not a little coffee, a lot of coffee, all over his pale shirt. And he had laughed. Not the "this crazy woman is driving me insane" kind of laugh, but a real one, a beautiful one, the kind of laugh you wanted to hear again. And his eyes. God, those eyes. Tired, yes, there was. Exhaustion there. One she recognized even amid the chaos of the moment. But there had also been kindness, and humor, and something else she couldn't quite name before she had to rush away. When she finally got home, she dropped her bag on the couch, set the rescued fern on the window, and grabbed her phone. Maren answered on the second ring, her face filling the screen in a video call. "San, what happened? You're out of breath." "I spilled coffee on a man in the subway." Maren didn't even blink. "Of course you did. But Maren, he was..." Sandra paused, searching for the right word. "Interesting." Now Maren looked intrigued, sitting up straighter. "Interesting how?" "Like, he had sad eyes but a beautiful smile, and he wore a gray overcoat that looked really good on him. And he didn't yell at me when I ruined his shirt." Sandra blurted out all at once, still holding the crooked plant under her arm. "Are you describing a man or a character from a British film?" "I'm describing a stranger I'll probably never see again, who'll remember me as that crazy coffee girl." Maren smiled knowingly through the screen. "Or maybe he'll remember you as that interesting girl who carried a plant on the subway." Sandra considered that for a moment, then shook her head. "No, I'm definitely the crazy coffee girl. I tried to dry his shirt with a used napkin, Maren. Used. With lipstick." Maren burst into genuine laughter, the kind that only came out in moments of absolute absurdity. "You're a work of art, San. I'm a walking disaster. Those two things are not mutually exclusive." Sandra sighed, finally placing the fern into an improvised pot on the window while holding the phone between her shoulder and cheek. "I know, but there's no point thinking about it. The New York subway carries millions of people every day. The chances of running into the same man again are astronomically low." "Maybe," Maren agreed, "but you never." "No, New York's big, but it's also strangely small sometimes." After they hung up, Sandra wrapped herself in the couch blanket, glancing at the rescued fern now perched on the window, and found herself thinking about him again, about the way he had laughed, as if he had forgotten how to do it and was rediscovering it right there. There had been something in that laugh, something broken being mended, even if just for an instant. She allowed herself a second of fantasy. What if she saw him again? What if that had been the beginning of her love story? "You watch too many movies," she murmured to herself, echoing Maren's words. But as she closed her eyes, Sandra smiled, because if there was one thing she had in abundance, it was stubborn hope. And maybe, just maybe, the universe was planning something. Conrad came home with a ruined shirt and a strange feeling in his chest that had nothing to do with caffeine. He took off his overcoat, tossed the stained shirt into the laundry basket, and stood in the middle of the living room processing what had just happened. A woman had collided with him on the subway, spilled coffee, tried to clean it with a used napkin, and he had laughed. When was the last time something truly random had happened in his life? When was the last time someone had surprised him? Conrad walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and caught himself smiling, which was ridiculous. He was smiling because of an accident involving coffee and a plant. "You're losing it, Foster," he muttered to himself. But the truth was, for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel completely drained. There was something there, a small crack in the gray wall he had built around his own life. He didn't know her name. He didn't have her number. He had nothing but a ruined shirt and the memory of a genuine smile. But as Conrad showered and changed clothes, finally settling onto the couch without turning on the television or opening a single file, he found himself wondering, what if that hadn't been just a random accident? What if it was the beginning of something? He shook his head, pushing the thought away. He was tired. That was all. Fatigue made the mind play tricks. But when he fell asleep that night, Conrad dreamed of bright eyes, an absurd fern, and the sound of his own laughter echoing inside a subway car. And for the first time in a very long while, he slept through the night. Sandra woke up the next morning with an idea that Marin would immediately define as questionable at best. But Sandra preferred to call it strategically bold. The logic was simple. If she had met that man once on the subway, she could meet him again. Statistically improbable, maybe. Impossible, definitely not. People had routines. They took the same lines, at the same times. It was just a matter of planning. "So you're planning to become a subway stalker?" Marin asked as Sandra presented her theory during their morning shift at the cafe, without even looking up from the espresso machine she was cleaning. "It's not stalking if it's just being in the right place at the right time. That is literally the definition of stalking, San. It's urban romance," Sandra corrected, pouring a cappuccino with far more concentration than necessary. Marin paused, finally glancing up at her friend with that familiar expression Sandra knew so well, half concern, half amusement, and entirely, "You've lost your mind, but I'll still support you. All right, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that you're not completely insane. What's the plan?" Sandra pulled a small notebook from her bag, the same one she used for special customer orders, now featuring a page dedicated to what she mentally called Operation Second Encounter. "I was on the Blue Line, eastbound, around 6 in the evening. He was too. Or he was going anywhere from anywhere. Details," Sandra dismissed with a wave. "The point is, I'll vary the times. Take the subway earlier, later, on different days. Eventually, our orbits will cross again." Marin took the notebook from Sandra's hands and examined it with the seriousness of someone analyzing crime evidence. "You wrote down gray overcoat, tired but kind eyes. Approximate height 6'1". I'm observant. You're obsessed. I'm interested. San, you spilled coffee on him and ran away. He probably forgot about you in 5 minutes," Marin said, handing the notebook back. But her tone had softened. "Still, if you really want to do this, at least let me help you not look like a complete stalker." Sandra blinked, surprised. "You're going to help me. Someone has to keep you alive and document this madness for when you need to explain it to your future grandkids." Marin folded her arms, thinking, "Okay, rule number 1, vary the lines, but keep a logical pattern. You," said he had that exhausted look, like a professional who works too much. Doctor, lawyer, something like that. If that's the case, he probably takes the subway near offices or hospitals in the corporate areas. That's surprisingly helpful. I've watched police dramas for years, San. Tracking people is basically my specialty." She paused. That sounded way less creepy in my head. A little, yeah. Rule number 2, if you find him, don't run. Talk to him, like a normal human being. "I can do that. No spilling." "I can't promise that." Marin sighed but smiled. "You're a lost cause. But you're my favorite lost cause in the world." The first attempt happened 2 days later. Sandra took the same line, at the same hour, wearing what Marin had called casual but deliberate. Dark jeans, a light blouse, a scarf that framed her face in a flattering way. Nothing over the top, just intentional. She stepped into the subway car, heart racing, eyes scanning every male face in the approximate age range. Gray overcoat, 6'1", straight posture, tired eyes. Nothing. The car was crowded, but none of the men there was him. Sandra got off at the 4th stop, turned around, took the train back, and tried again. Still nothing. When she returned to the cafe at the end of the day, Marin was locking up. "So, did you find Prince Charming?" "No, but I found a guy selling fake watches and a woman carrying 7 puppies in a handbag." "Ah, the full New York subway experience?" Marin said, locking the door as they started walking together. "Are you going to try again?" "Obviously. Of course you are, because you're as stubborn as a lovesick mule. Stubborn is just another word for persistent, and stalker is just another word for stalker." Sandra elbowed her, laughing. The next day, Sandra tried around lunchtime. Maybe he worked nearby. Maybe he took the subway midday. The car was less crowded, which made searching easier, but also made her look exactly like what she was doing, desperately searching for someone. A subway security guard gave her a suspicious look after she went up and down the same station 3 times. "Everything okay, ma'am?" "Yes, totally. Just forgot something," Sandra improvised, hurrying off before he could ask for details. When she told Marin about it later, her friend was wiping down tables before closing. "San, you were stopped by security?" "Technically, it was just a, concerned question. You're becoming a person of interest in public transit investigations." "Unnecessary dramatization." "Necessary and accurate," Marin said, tossing the rag into the sink. "Look, I admire the dedication, but maybe you should consider that if it's meant to happen, it will happen. You don't need to become the new subway vigilante. But what if I quit right when I'm close? And what if you keep going and he never shows up? You're going to spend your whole life riding subway cars looking for a ghost?" Sandra had no answer for that. The following week, she started switching lines. Maybe he didn't always take the same one. Maybe he had appointments in different parts of the city. New York was huge, but the subway system created its own patterns. Everyone had their favorite routes. It was on the Green Line, on a rainy afternoon, that the first memorable incident happened. Sandra was so focused on scanning passengers that she didn't notice the street musician settling beside her with a guitar. When he began to play, loudly, enthusiastically, and slightly off-key, she jumped, hit her elbow against the pole, and dropped her bag. Its contents scattered across the subway floor. Wallet, lipstick, keys, 3 crumpled napkins, a sugar packet, and, inexplicably, a spoon. "Why do you have a spoon in your purse?" asked an elderly lady, helping her pick up the items. "Culinary emergencies," Sandra answered automatically, cheeks so burning red. The musician assumed the commotion was part of the act and began playing even louder, drawing curious looks. A tourist took a photo. A teenager filmed a video. Sandra snatched up her bag, muttered hurried thanks, and got off at the next stop. Not hers, just to escape the unwanted attention. By the time she arrived at Clover and Steam, drenched from the rain and emotionally exhausted, Marin took one look at her and immediately served a hot chocolate. "Rough day?" "I came public entertainment on the subway." "Ah." Marin set the mug in front of her. "Want to talk about it? There's a video on YouTube." "Of course there is." Marin grabbed her phone, searched for a few seconds, then turned the screen toward her. "This one?" Sandra looked. There she was, in pixelated glory, picking up a spoon from the floor while an off-key guitarist played in the background. The caption read, "NYC Subway Energy." "I hate this city," Sandra muttered, but couldn't stop laughing. "You love this city, and this city loves you in a chaotic and mildly concerning way," Marin said, sitting beside her. "Look, San, how long have you been doing this? 2 weeks? More or less. And you've already been questioned by security, turned into a meme, and are probably on the MTA's watch list. Maybe it's time to accept that." "No," Sandra interrupted. "Just a little longer. Please." Marin looked at her friend, at that stubborn hope in her eyes, and sighed. "Fine, but when you're officially banned from the public transit system, don't blame me. Fair. And if you find him, you call me immediately. I want updates in real time. Promise." Marin raised her mug of hot chocolate in a solemn toast. To love and the madness it brings. Sandra clinked her mug against Marin's. To madness. 2 more weeks went by. Sandra kept taking the subway at different times, on different lines, always with that stubborn hope that the familiar face would appear in the crowd. Marin wavered between concern and amusement, but deep down she admired her friend's determination. It was on a particularly frustrating afternoon, after yet another fruitless search, that Sandra returned to the cafe defeated. Nothing? Marin asked, already knowing the answer from the look on her friend's face. Nothing. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to accept it was just a random moment. Marin stopped what she was doing and turned fully toward Sandra. Wait, you're giving up? You, Sandra Holly, the woman who once spent 3 hours trying to retrieve an earring from the drain because it had sentimental value, are giving up? It's not giving up. It's readjusting expectations. That's the mature way of saying giving up, Marin said, crossing her arms. Look, you're crazy. You've been chasing a stranger through the New York subway system for weeks. That's either insane or incredibly romantic. And, knowing you, it's both. But maybe it's time to get back to reality. Or, Marin countered, maybe it's time to stop searching and let him find you. You've done your part. Now let the universe do its thing. Sandra looked at her friend, processing. Since when do you believe in the universe? Since you dragged me into this chaotic romance. Now I'm invested. I want my vicarious happy ending. Sandra laughed, feeling something settle quietly inside her chest. Maybe Marin was right. Maybe she had done everything she could. The rest was up to fate. All right, she agreed. No more searching. If it's meant to happen, it will. Finally, sanity, Marin celebrated. Now come help me with these orders before I give up on you too. And as they worked side by side, organizing the cafe for the next day, Sandra felt a strange sense of peace. She had tried. She had taken a chance. And if it all led nowhere, at least she'd have the story. What she didn't know was that the universe had simply been waiting for the right moment. And that moment was only a few days away. Quite literally, at the door of Clover and Steam. Clover and Steam had a sacred morning ritual. Marin made the coffee while Sandra arranged the tables, and both complained about starting the day before the sun was fully up. It was comforting, predictable, and exactly the kind of routine that kept Sandra grounded in reality after an entire month of failed subway searches. She had officially given up, or rather she had readjusted expectations as she insisted on calling it. The man in the gray overcoat had become a pleasant memory, nothing more. A small, funny story to tell at future dinners. That time I spilled coffee on a stranger and thought it was love at first sight. You're awfully quiet, Marin observed, adjusting the espresso machine. That worries me. By now you've usually dropped something or rescued a dying plant. I'm just existing. Peacefully. Peaceful existence is overrated. I prefer when you exist catastrophically, it's more entertaining. Marin turned, leaning on the counter. But seriously, are you okay? Sandra shrugged, wiping down a table that was already spotless. I am. I think I finally accepted that the whole thing was just coincidence, nothing more. Look at you, being mature and rational. I'm almost proud. Almost. Fully proud would ruin my reputation. Marin smiled. But honestly, San, I know you wanted it to be more. But the fact that you tried, that you took a chance, that counts. Most people just sit around waiting for magic to happen, and I ended up looking like a lunatic on the subway. A brave lunatic. There's a difference. Sandra smiled, grateful. Marin always knew what to say, even when what she said was completely absurd. The morning passed smoothly. The usual customers came in. The executive who always ordered a double espresso and never made eye. Contact, the freelance writer who occupied the corner table for 4 hours straight, while buying only one tea. The elderly couple who split a croissant and debated politics gently as if it were a sport. Sandra served everyone with the automatic efficiency of someone who knew her job by heart, but her mind was elsewhere. Maybe it was time to try something new. A class, a hobby, something to shake the feeling that her life was good, but not exactly exciting. Earth to Sandra. Marin snapped her fingers in front of her face. Customer at the door. Sandra blinked back to reality and turned to greet whoever had come in. That was when the cafe door opened and someone stepped inside. Sandra's back was turned. busy arranging cups behind the counter so she didn't see him right away. But she heard the voice, low, polite, slightly rough from fatigue. "A plain coffee, please. No sugar." Something in that voice made Sandra freeze. There was a familiarity in it, an echo of memory her brain was still processing when she turned around. And then she saw him. Gray overcoat, about 6'1", tired but kind eyes, and the face she had spent an entire month searching for in subway cars. Time stopped, or at least, it felt like it did. Sandra stood there, mouth slightly open, holding a cup halfway between the shelf and the counter, trying to process the absolutely impossible fact that the universe had just delivered exactly what she wanted. But in the one place she least expected it. Marin, ever observant, noticed her friend's paralysis and followed her gaze to the customer. It took her exactly 2 seconds to connect the dots. Gray overcoat, the right height, that slightly slouched posture of exhaustion Sandra had described in obsessive detail. "Sandra!" Marin called, but her voice sounded distant, muffled by the sound of Sandra's own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Conrad was looking at the menu on the wall, unaware of who was behind the counter, but something must have caught his attention, maybe the silence, maybe just instinct, because he lowered his eyes and recognized her. Sandra saw the exact moment it happened. Surprise flickered across his face, his eyes widening slightly, followed by what looked like genuine amusement. And then that smile, the same smile she had seen on the subway, the smile that had made her stomach twist and had driven her to spend an entire month looking for him. "You," he said, his tone almost incredulous. "Me," Sandra confirmed, as eloquent as ever in crucial moments. Marin looked between them, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous combination of joy and mischief. "Oh," she said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Oh." Conrad took a step closer to the counter, his hands in his pockets, trying to appear casual, though Sandra recognized the slight nervousness in the way he moved. She knew nervousness. She was drowning in her own at that very moment. "So you work here," Conrad said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost relieved. "For 4 years," Sandra replied, finally finding her voice. "Every day, same place, not running all over New York on public transport like a normal person." He laughed, that same short, genuine laugh she'd memorized. "I've walked past this place a few times, never came in. Well, today you did. Apparently." There was a silence that could have been awkward, but somehow wasn't. It was charged, yes, but not uncomfortable. Something lingered in the air. Recognition, curiosity, possibility. Marin, who had been watching the exchange with the intensity of someone witnessing the season finale of an addictive series, decided it was time to intervene. Subtlety had never been her strength, and frankly, she was far too invested in this story to let the two of them just stand there staring at each other like shy teenagers. "So," she said, joining Sandra behind the counter, with all the grace of an elephant in high heels, "this is the mysterious man who's been making your heart skip a beat?" Sandra closed her eyes. Of course, Marin would do this. "Marin," she hissed through her teeth. "What?" Marin feigned innocence with the skill of a soap opera actress. "You spent a month looking for the guy. He shows up. I'm just speeding up the process, doing you both a favor. You're being invasive. I'm being efficient. There's a difference." Conrad blinked, processing the information, and then something shifted in his expression. Amusement gave way to genuine surprise, followed by what looked almost like hope. "You were looking for me?" Sandra wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole, but since that wasn't an option, she did the only thing she could. She admitted it. "Maybe," she said, trying to sound casual and failing miserably. "A little." "A whole month," Marin added cheerfully, clearly enjoying herself. "Far too much. Different subway lines, different times. She even became a YouTube meme. It was beautiful, tragic, but beautiful. Marin, I swear on everything holy." "By the way, San," Marin interrupted, turning to her friend with a dangerous sparkle in her eyes. "With all this emotional excitement, you might need a cardiologist. Your heart won't survive the adrenaline." Conrad let out a genuine laugh. "Funny you should mention that. I'm a cardiologist." There was a moment of absolute silence. Marin blinked, looked at Sandra, then back at Conrad. "You're kidding." "No," Conrad replied, clearly amused now. So you literally fix hearts, Marin said, pointing between him and Sandra. And she literally needs one. That's ridiculously perfect. Like no screenwriter could have come up with this better. She paused dramatically, eyes gleaming. There, I've decided. From now on, you're Dr. Heartbeat. Sandra groaned, covering her face with her hands, torn, between laughing and dying of embarrassment. Marin, please. Too late, it's done, Marin declared, completely satisfied with herself. Dr. Heartbeat, because you make hearts race professionally and… She gestured vaguely between him and Sandra, apparently romantically as well. Conrad was laughing openly now, and Sandra could only hide behind her hands, half mortified, half amused. I'll take the title, Conrad said, still chuckling. Of course you will. It's perfect, Marin said, folding her arms with satisfaction. Well, now that we've established you two are soulmates destined by the universe itself, and that Dr. Heartbeat here will need to monitor my best friend's cardiac activity, is someone going to order that coffee, or are we just going to discuss medical coincidences all day? Marin, I swear, the coffee's getting cold, Marin interrupted, pointing to the machine with exaggerated concern. Someone should probably do something. But Conrad was smiling now. Not a polite smile, not the weary one he wore like armor. A genuine, wide smile that reached his eyes and lit up his entire face. You spent a month looking for me on the subway? Sandra sighed, defeated. Yes. And before you ask, yes. I realize how strange that sounds, but you laughed. On the subway. And it had been so long since I'd seen someone laugh like that. As if they'd forgotten how and were remembering again. And I just wanted to see it one more time. The silence that followed was different, heavier, more meaningful. Conrad looked at her for a long moment, and Sandra saw something change in those tired eyes. Something opened, softened, a vulnerability he rarely showed. I was looking too, he admitted quietly. Not as strategically, but I did take the subway more often than I needed to, just in case. Marin made a noise that suspiciously sounded like I knew it, but had the decency to step away a little, granting them the illusion of privacy, even in the open space of the cafe. She positioned herself by the espresso machine, pretending to be busy, though Sandra knew perfectly well she was listening to every word, probably already planning how to retell this story for years to come. So, Sandra said, gathering every ounce of courage she had, do you still want that coffee? Actually, Conrad replied, taking his hands out of his pockets. I was wondering if you have a lunch break, and if you'd be willing to spend it with me, preferably without any spilled coffee this time. Sandra felt her heart speed up, that strange, weightless rush you get in an elevator dropping too fast. I can negotiate that. The no spilled coffee part isn't exactly guaranteed, but I can try. That's a risk I'm willing to take. Across the counter, Marin was practically vibrating with contained satisfaction. She's got her lunch break at 2, she announced, abandoning any pretense of discretion. And I'll cover her shift. No arguments, no discussion, non-negotiable. Sandra should have been embarrassed. She should have protested, but the truth was, she was smiling in a way she hadn't in a long time, and there simply wasn't room for anything else. 2 o'clock then, Conrad confirmed, that same smile still tugging at his lips as if he too had forgotten how to do it and now couldn't stop. I'll come back. I'll be here. Probably spilling something on someone, but I'll be here. Laughed again, and Sandra memorized the sound, added it to the growing mental collection she was already building. Conrad gave a small wave, simple, but somehow weighted with more meaning than it should have, and walked out of the cafe. As soon as the door closed, Sandra let her body collapse against the counter, her legs suddenly feeling like gelatin. Oh my God. I told you, Marin practically screamed, abandoning all restraint. I told you if it was meant to happen, it, would. Did you listen? No, but I was right. You didn't say that at all. I thought it very loudly. Thinking loudly counts. Marin grabbed Sandra by the shoulders, forcing her to meet her eyes. San, this is real. He was looking for you too. He showed up. The universe literally delivered the man to the front door of this cafe. I know, Sandra said, her voice sounding strangled. I know, and I'm panicking. Good panic or bad panic? Panic as in, this could actually be something real, and I'm terrified of ruining it. Marin let go of her shoulders and took Sandra's face in her hands instead, forcing eye contact. Listen to me. You are Sandra Holly. You rescue dying plants. You remember every regular customer's name. You spent a whole month looking for a stranger on the subway because he laughed. You are brave, kind, and yes, clumsy, but that's part of your charm. So you're going to that lunch, you're going to be exactly who you are, and you're going to let this be whatever it's meant to be. She paused, a grin forming. But for the love of God, try not to spill anything on him. Once was funny. Twice becomes a concerning pattern. Sandra laughed, her eyes shining with a mix of nerves and relief. Okay, I can do this. You can do this, Marin confirmed, releasing her. Now come help me before I do all the work myself and charge you later. The following hours were delicious torture. Sandra tried to work normally, but she was acutely aware of every second ticking by. She served customers on autopilot, burned a croissant, forgot an elderly woman's order twice, and dropped an entire box of sugar packets on the floor. You need to calm down, Marin muttered once the cafe had thinned out. I am calm. You're having a slow-motion meltdown. Same thing. Definitely not. Marin grabbed a broom and started sweeping up the sugar. Look, I know you're nervous, but remember, he was looking too. He wants to be here. This isn't one-sided. And what if I say something stupid? You will. Statistically, you will. But from what I've seen, he seems to like your kind of stupid. Was that a compliment? It's the closest you'll ever get from me. Despite her nerves, Sandra smiled. Marin was right, she always was. When 2 o'clock finally arrived, along with Conrad, punctual as ever, still in his gray overcoat but looking less tired, Sandra untied her apron with trembling hands. Ready? He asked. Sandra glanced at Marin, who was already waving her off with exaggerated gestures, probably to avoid making an even bigger scene. Ready. They stepped out of the cafe side by side, and Sandra felt a strange but wonderful sense that something was beginning. Something real. Something built on spilled coffee, dying plants, and a month of failed searches that, in the end, hadn't been failures at all. As they walked down the New York sidewalk, weaving through tourists and street vendors, Conrad glanced at her and smiled. So, where to? Sandra thought for a moment, then pointed toward a small diner on the corner. There, they make the best sandwiches around, and I promise not to spill anything on you. Just promise you'll try. That one I can keep. Behind them, unseen but very much present, Marin watched through the cafe window with a satisfied smile. She had seen Sandra go through a painful breakup, had watched her rebuild herself, slowly, and now she was witnessing the beginning of something that had every chance of becoming truly special. Finally, Marin murmured to herself as she returned to work. About time the universe got its act together, and for the first time in a long while, everything felt exactly as it should. The diner Sandra chose was the kind of place that had existed in New York for decades, without anyone knowing exactly when it began. Faded posters lined the walls, the Formica counter gleamed under fluorescent light, and the menu offered everything from burgers to Greek salads with the same questionable confidence. Conrad held the door open for Sandra, an old-fashioned gesture she found unexpectedly charming, and they chose a booth by the window, where the filtered afternoon light created uneven patterns across the tabletop. So, Sandra began after they ordered, "Cardiologist?" Conrad raised an eyebrow. Apparently, though the way that fact was revealed was creative, and my new nickname even more creative, Dr. Heartbeat. He laughed and Sandra felt her cheeks warm. There may have been some dramatization involved, she admitted, but before that, I only had the essential details. Gray overcoat, nice smile, unusual patience with people who spill coffee. Very essential, he agreed, amusement flickering in his eyes. There was less exhaustion in them than she remembered from the subway, or maybe he was just better at hiding it now. And you? Conrad asked, leaning slightly forward. Do you work at the cafe by calling or by circumstance? A little of both, Sandra said, silently thanking the timing of the food's arrival for giving her something to do with her hands. I started 4 years ago, after college. It was supposed to be temporary while I figured out what to do with my life. But then I discovered I liked it. The people, the conversations, the rhythm of it. There's something comforting about making Coffee for someone clearly having a bad day and watching them leave a little lighter. Conrad watched her as she spoke, and Sandra realized he was really listening, not just waiting for his turn to talk, but taking in every word as if it mattered. "That makes sense," he said finally. "Taking care of people, even if it's just with caffeine and empathy. And you take care of people by literally fixing hearts." Technically, there was something about the way he said it. A hesitation, a shadow crossing his expression. That made Sandra pause. Technically, Conrad picked up his water glass, turning it slowly as if deciding how much to share. "It's been complicated lately. Medicine, I mean. I love what I do. Or I did. I'm not sure which tense applies anymore." Sandra set her sandwich back on the plate, her full attention on him now. What happened? He hesitated, and she could almost see the battle inside him. The instinct to stay guarded against, the rare desire to be honest. Finally, he sighed and the words came. "I lost a patient a few weeks ago. I did everything right. Technically I did, but it wasn't enough. And when you have to look a family in the eye and tell them their person isn't coming home, even after 12 years of doing this, it still breaks you." The raw honesty in his voice hit Sandra square in the chest. She didn't have any rehearsed words of comfort, no neat phrases to make it better, so she did the only thing that felt right. She reached across the table and lightly touched his fingers. "I'm sorry," she said simply and sincerely. Conrad looked at her hand, then up at her face, and something shifted. A softening, a small crack in the armor he had so carefully built. "That's why I was on the subway that day," he admitted. "Glenn, my friend, told me I needed to get out of my routine, do something different. So I left the car and," he smiled, slightly crooked, "found a woman, carrying a fern who reminded me that there are still unexpected things in the world." Sandra felt a flutter in her chest, a good kind of ache. "The fern survived, if you're wondering." "I was. Deeply concerned, actually." "Liar." "Completely." They both laughed and the tension dissolved into something lighter. The conversation flowed naturally then, drifting between serious and silly topics with the ease of two people who were, surprisingly, comfortable with each other. Sandra told him about life at the cafe, about Marin and her obsession with crime shows, and about the time she accidentally adopted a cat that later turned out to belong to the upstairs neighbor. Conrad talked about medicine, about Glenn and his constant attempts to set him up on disastrous dates, about how he'd completely forgotten what it felt like to have a life outside the hospital. "When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to?" Sandra asked, stealing a fry from his plate. Conrad thought for a long moment. "Honestly, I can't remember." "That's sad." "I know." "Then let's fix it," Sandra declared, with that characteristic impulsiveness Marin always said would get her into trouble. "Next week, you pick something, anything, and we'll do it." "Anything?" "Anything that doesn't involve hospitals or imminent death." Conrad laughed, and Sandra mentally noted the sound again. She was collecting those laughs, she realized, saving each one as proof that he still remembered how to do it. "All right," he agreed. "But you have to choose something too, to be fair." "Deal." They shook hands across the table, a formal, slightly silly gesture that lasted a bit longer than it should have. Conrad's fingers were warm, steady, and when he didn't immediately let go, Sandra felt her heart start to race. "So," she said, trying to sound casual, "is this the part where we exchange numbers? Or are we still going with the whole casual, public transportation stalking approach?" "I think we can evolve," Conrad replied, taking out his phone, though the subway method did eventually work. "After a month of failed attempts on my part and active denial on yours." Details. They exchanged numbers, and Sandra saved his contact as cardiologist in the overcoat. Conrad caught a glimpse and raised an eyebrow. "Seriously? What?" "It's descriptive. I could save you as coffee woman, but that feels reductive. I'd prefer plant heroin." Duly noted. By the time they left the diner, almost 2 hours had passed. The sun hung low, casting long shadows on the sidewalk, and there was a chill in the air that signaled the end of the afternoon. Conrad insisted on walking Sandra back to Clover and Steam, despite her protests that he probably had more important things to do. "Nothing more important than making sure you don't trip and fall before we get there," he said, and Sandra couldn't decide whether to feel insulted or charmed. She chose charmed. When they reached the cafe door, Marin was visibly pretending not to spy through the window, and failing miserably. "Your friend is subtle," Conrad observed. "Like a fire alarm. It's part of her charm." They stood there in that awkward post-date moment where neither of them knew exactly what the protocol was. A kiss felt premature, a handshake too formal, a hug felt right and terrifying. Conrad broke the stalemate by leaning in and pressing a gentle kiss to her cheek. A soft, almost old-fashioned gesture that made Sandra feel like she'd stepped into a 1950s movie. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for looking, for not giving up, for not this." Sandra smiled, her face warm where his lips had touched. "Thank you for showing up, and for not suing me for property damage. The shirt was a necessary sacrifice. Heroic, I'd say." He laughed once more, then stepped back, giving a small wave before disappearing around the corner into the city crowd. Sandra stood there a little longer, one hand pressed to her cheek, a blissful, foolish grin spreading across her face, until Marin burst through the door. "Get in here now and tell me everything." Sandra laughed and let herself be dragged inside, where she spent the next hour reliving every detail, every word, every look, while Marin listened with the focus of a detective solving a critical case. "You're doomed," Marin declared finally. "I know. Like completely gone. I know. And you're loving every second of it." Sandra smiled, that kind of smile that ached because it was too real, too full, completely. Marin folded her arms, her expression somewhere between serious and teasing. "Okay, but now for the important part. You're not going to mess this up, right?" "What do you mean?" "San, you have a history. Remember Greg? You pretended to be allergic to cats because you thought he loved his too much and you didn't want to compete. That was 3 years ago. And Jonathan, you broke up with him because you decided he deserved someone less chaotic. Your words, not mine." Sandra winced. "Okay, fair. But this is different. Is it? Or are you already mentally listing all the ways it could go wrong?" Sandra opened her mouth to deny it, but closed it again, because Marin was right. She was already doing exactly that. What if he realizes I'm too much? Too chaotic, too clumsy, too intense?" Marin gripped her friend's shoulders, forcing eye contact. "Listen, he looked for you on the subway, too. He showed up here. He spent 2 hours in a questionable diner with you and looked genuinely happy. The guy likes you, San. The real you. So don't start inventing excuses to sabotage it before it even begins." "But what if—" No what ifs. This time you're going to let it happen. Promise." Sandra looked at her best friend, at that fierce determination blazing in her eyes, and felt something settle inside her. "I promise I'll try not to mess it up." "You're going to not mess it up," Marin corrected, "and I'll be here to remind you every time you start to spiral." "Thank you, Mar. You're welcome. Now go home, take a shower, and stop walking around with that love-struck expression. You're scaring the imaginary customers we don't have because we already closed." Sandra laughed and grabbed her bag, but before leaving, she turned back. "Do you think this is real? That it could actually work?" Marin smiled genuinely. "I think it has a better chance of working than anything else you've ever tried. So yes, bet on it." Conrad came home that night with a feeling he didn't immediately recognize. It took a few minutes, as he hung up his coat and brewed tea he would forget to drink, to identify it. Happiness. Simple, unexpected, slightly terrifying happiness. He picked up his phone and stared at the saved contact. Sandra. Plant heroin. He grinned at the screen like an idiot. Then he typed a message, deleted it, typed another, deleted that one too. On the third try, he finally sent, "Got home with no coffee incidents. Successful day." The reply came less than a minute later. "Always good when no one ends up stained. Same time next week?" Conrad smiled, looked at the message, at the lamplight reflecting off the forgotten tea, at the apartment that suddenly felt less empty, and typed back, "Definitely." And for the first time in months, Conrad fell asleep not thinking about surgeries, reports, or the losses he couldn't undo. He thought about bright eyes, genuine laughter, and the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let someone in again, even if that someone had an alarming tendency toward accidents involving hot liquids. But the following week felt endless. They texted back and forth, starting formal, shifting to funny, then to those late-night conversations that made Conrad lose track of time. Sandra sent photos of the plants she rescued, most of which were already beyond saving, though he never had the heart to tell her. He sent stories from the hospital that she swore were better than any medical show. When the day of their second date finally arrived, Conrad was nervous in a way he hadn't been since high school. He changed shirts 3 times. Glenn had teased him about it all day. They met outside Clover. Steam in the late afternoon. Sandra had finished her shift early, and when she stepped out of the cafe, Conrad felt the air leave his lungs. She wore a simple dress, her hair loose, and that same smile that had made him laugh on the subway. "Hi," she said, and there was a hint of nerves in her voice. "Hi," Conrad replied, and suddenly every rehearsed line in his head vanished. They walked aimlessly, just talking, laughing, learning more about each other. They ended up in a small park near the river, sitting on a bench while the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I still can't believe we ran into each other again," Conrad said, looking at her. "A month of searching the subway. That's crazy?" Sandra offered. "Brave," he corrected. "Most people would have given up." "I almost did," she admitted, glancing down at her hands. "Actually, I had given up, and then you showed up. Best timing of my life." Sandra turned to face him, and Conrad saw something change in her expression. Less nervousness, more resolve. "Conrad, I need to tell you something." "Okay. I'm terrible at relationships. I self-sabotage. I create problems. I get scared and run." The words came fast, like she had to say them before she lost her courage. "And I don't want to do that with you, but I also don't know if I can promise I won't." Conrad was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he took her hand. "I'm terrible too. My last relationship ended because I was always at the hospital, because I didn't know how to be present even when I was physically there." He squeezed her fingers gently. "But I want to try. With you, even if it scares me." Sandra felt her stomach tighten. "Even knowing I might spill coffee on you again? Especially because of that." She laughed, that genuine, unguarded laugh. And then it happened. Conrad leaned in, closing the space between them, and this time it wasn't a chaste kiss. On the cheek, it was real. His hands found her face, fingers tracing along her jawline before slipping into her hair. Sandra's heart raced, ironically in need of a cardiologist, and she simply melted into the moment. The kiss started gentle, tentative, but deepened quickly. There were months of anticipation behind it, weeks of slow build-up, days of quiet longing. Conrad drew her closer, as if the distance between them had suddenly become unbearable, and Sandra clutched the lapel of his overcoat, that damned gray overcoat she had searched for across every subway car in New York. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Their foreheads rested together, eyes still closed, breaths mingling in the cool air. Sandra began but couldn't finish. "I know," Conrad murmured, and there was something in his voice, restrained desire, an unspoken promise. They stayed like that for a long moment, just existing together in the quiet space between one kiss and the next, until Sandra pulled back enough to meet his gaze. "So," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "this is real," Conrad finished for her. "Very real. Terrifyingly real. Completely terrifying," he agreed, but he was smiling. "And I don't want to be anywhere else." Sandra smiled back, that kind of smile that hurt because it was too genuine, and leaned in to kiss him again. Shorter this time, but no less meaningful. When night had fully fallen and they finally rose, from the bench, their hands still intertwined, something had shifted. They were no longer two strangers who had bumped into each other on the subway. They were two people who had chosen, actively, consciously, to take a risk. Conrad walked her home, and at her building's doorway he kissed her once more. Longer, deeper, filled with all the unspoken promises between them. "Good night, Sandra." "Good night, Conrad." He waited until she was inside, giving one last wave before turning to leave. And for the first time in months, Conrad went to sleep not thinking about surgeries or reports or losses he couldn't undo. He thought about bright eyes, genuine laughter, the taste of her lips, and the terrifying certainty that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let someone in again, even if that someone had an alarming tendency toward accidents involving hot liquids. 3 months had passed, 3 months of lunches that turned into dinners, of text messages that started formal and ended with inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else, of Conrad showing up at Clover and Steam at random hours just because he happened to be nearby, a lie Sandra never questioned, because secretly she adored it. 3 months of discoveries, that Conrad was terrible at cooking but excellent at ordering takeout, that Sandra sang off key when she was excessively happy and didn't care one bit, that both of them had an irrational fear of pigeons, though for completely different reasons, and that 3 a.m. phone conversations were surprisingly easy when it was with the right person. But also, 3 months of care, of not rushing, of building something slowly, brick by brick, because both had been broken before and understood the value of patience. They weren't officially anything. They hadn't had the talk, but there was an unspoken exclusivity between them, a silent understanding neither of them needed to say aloud yet. It was both terrifying and comforting, like wearing new shoes that were finally starting to mold perfectly to your feet. It was on a winter afternoon that things began to change. Sandra was closing the cafe when the door suddenly swung open, bringing with it a rush of cold wind, and a figure she neither expected nor wanted to see. Michael Evans had the kind of looks that would age well, dark hair always perfectly combed, a sharp jawline, and that confident smirk of someone who had never truly been rejected. They had broken up 8 months ago, and Sandra had made it a point to stay far, far away. "San," he said, the nickname sounding wrong now. "I came to see you. Can I come in?" Sandra considered saying no, but curiosity, or maybe politeness, won. She gestured briefly, leaving the door unlocked. She had no intention of keeping him long. Michael stepped inside and held out a bouquet. "Lilies. Still your favorite, right?" "They were," Sandra corrected, not taking the flowers. "What do you want, Michael?" "I made a mistake. Breaking up with you was a mistake. Maybe we could try again." Sandra blinked, processing that. "Are you serious?" "Completely. I've grown, San. I'm ready now." "Michael, you broke up with me because you said you needed to find yourself, which really meant I met someone more interesting." "How did that go, by the way?" He had the decency to look ashamed. "It didn't work out, but it made me realize what I'd lost. And you think you can just show up here 8 months later and I'm going to win you back," he interrupted. "Because we were good together." Sandra opened her mouth to reply, but the sound of the door opening again cut her off. Conrad stepped in, freezing when he saw the scene. His entire body reacted, a flash of tension he tried to hide. But Sandra noticed. She saw the way his jaw tightened, his shoulders squared, the flicker of something dark in his eyes before it was buried, behind a polite neutral mask. "Sorry," he said quickly, already stepping back. "I didn't know you had. I'll come back later." "No," Sandra said too fast, too urgently. "Stay, please." Conrad hesitated, and Sandra saw the battle within him, the desire to stay warring against the instinct to retreat, to not interfere, to protect himself. He'd been hurt before. She knew that, and now she was asking him to stay, vulnerable and exposed, while her ex stood there holding flowers. Miguel looked between them, the realization dawning in his eyes. "You're seeing someone? 8 months, San, and you already—" "It's none of your business," Sandra cut in sharply. "And even if it were, you have no right to judge. You left. You chose to walk away. I made a mistake, and I moved on." Michael turned to Conrad, something dark shadowing his expression. "You're really going to throw away what we had for someone you've known how long? A few months? Time doesn't measure depth," Sandra replied firmly. "And what we had was over long before you ended it." Michael's jaw flexed. He gripped the bouquet tighter. "You'll regret this. When this ends, you'll regret it." "Maybe," Sandra said, "but it'll be my choice, my risk to take." He brushed past Conrad without looking at him, and the door slammed behind him. Silence filled the space. Conrad stood near the entrance, hands in his pockets, a posture Sandra already recognized as defensive. He was closing off, protecting himself, rebuilding the walls he had spent months tearing down. She could see it happening, the emotional retreat, the distance creeping into his eyes even though he was only a few feet away. "Are you okay?" he asked finally, his voice too controlled, too neutral. "I don't know," Sandra admitted. "That was unexpected. Very ex. We broke up before I met you." Conrad nodded but didn't move. Sandra could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided, looking directly at her. Something was unfolding there, something dangerous. "He still loves you," Conrad said flatly. It wasn't a question, just a statement. "He loves the idea of me, not the same thing." Conrad said nothing and Sandra felt panic rising. She could lose him right there, in that moment, if she didn't do something. "You said I'm not someone else," Conrad finally said, still not looking at her. "So what am I?" The fear in his voice, buried beneath forced composure, broke something inside her. "You're the person who makes me laugh when I'm having the worst day. The one who shows up here just to see me for 10 minutes. The one who calls me at 2 in the morning because you remembered something funny. She paused. "You're the person I choose every day, even when it's terrifying." Conrad finally looked at her and Sandra saw raw vulnerability in his eyes. "I'm scared," he admitted softly, "of ruining this, of not being enough, of losing." "Again, me too. But I think it's worth being scared if it's for something real." Something shifted in his expression, something breaking open. Conrad closed the distance between them, his hands finding her arms, the touch gentle yet firm, as if he needed to confirm she was real. "Is this real to you?" "So real it hurts," Sandra confessed. "And you?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers, eyes closed, and she felt his body relax, the fear dissolving. "So real it scares me," he murmured. "But being scared feels right with you." A shiver ran down her spine, a good one, born of relief. They stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing together, until Conrad finally pulled back slightly. "Have dinner with me tonight, for real this time. No interruptions, just us." "Yes," Sandra said without hesitation, and as they locked up the cafe and stepped into the cold New York night, Sandra felt something settling in her chest. Fear, yes, but also hope. Conrad held her hand tightly as if he didn't want to let go, and for the first time in a long time, Sandra allowed herself to believe that maybe this could actually work. Dinner was exactly what they both needed. They talked about everything: favorite movies, worst childhood memories, dreams they still dared to admit. And when Conrad walked her to her apartment door, his goodnight kiss was long and lingering, full of promises of more meetings, more conversations, more everything. Sandra floated inside, her pulse still racing. She immediately texted Marin. "He kissed me, and I forgot my own name for 3 seconds. The reply came seconds later. 3 seconds? Amateur. But I'm proud. Now take a deep breath and don't make up excuses to sabotage this." Sandra laughed to herself, typing back, "No promises. Sandra Holly, I swear." Fine. I'll try. You will succeed. Now go to sleep before you start overthinking." Sandra smiled, setting her phone aside. Marin knew her far too well. She smiled again, whispering to herself, "I won't ruin it. At least I'll try really hard not to." But as Sandra fell asleep with a smile on her face, across the city, another complication was quietly forming. The next day, Conrad didn't notice Tazi approaching until it was too late. He was in the locker room changing out of his scrubs, exhausted after a long surgery, when she appeared at the IADA doorway. Tazi Anderson was a thoracic surgeon, competent, sharp, and with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was worth. "Hey," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Good surgery today." "Thanks. You too. Do you have a minute?" Her tone was different. Conrad's stomach tightened in warning. Of course. Tazi stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and Conrad knew before she even opened her mouth. "I'll be direct," she began. "I like you, Conrad. Not as a colleague, as a man." The silence that followed was heavy. Conrad felt something sink in his chest. Not surprise exactly, but confirmation of something he had subconsciously avoided acknowledging. He thought of Sandra, of how it had felt to see her ex at the cafe, that raw vulnerability of being on the outside of someone else's history. Now he was standing on the opposite side of that feeling. "Tazi, let me finish." She raised a hand. "I know you got out of a relationship, but it's been months. We work well together. It makes sense, doesn't it?" Conrad processed quickly. Tazi was remarkable. Any man would be lucky, but his heart was already taken, completely taken. Tussie, I just think about it, she said softly, and there was real vulnerability in her eyes. You don't have to answer now. She left before he could correct her, and Conrad remained standing there, guilt already creeping in. How was he supposed to say no without hurting someone he respected? How could he explain that his heart already belonged to someone else? He picked up his phone, thought about calling Sandra, but hesitated. She had already dealt with her ex showing up out of nowhere. It didn't feel fair to add more weight to her day. But as Conrad drove home, the situation pressed on him like a stone in his chest. He had to handle it. Tomorrow, without fail, because Sandra deserved honesty, and Tussie deserved clarity. But at that moment, all Conrad wanted was to go back to the woman he had chosen, and who had chosen him back. Dinner had been perfect. Conrad had picked a small Italian restaurant in the West Village, dimly lit, candles flickering on every table. They ate risotto that melted on their tongues, shared a bottle of wine, and laughed over stories that were only funny because they were together. It was light, easy, exactly what they both needed. But as they walked back, fingers intertwined, Sandra noticed the tension in his shoulders, a subtle distraction. "Are you okay?" she asked when they stopped in front of her building. Conrad hesitated, and she saw the battle play out in his eyes. But they had agreed. Honesty was non-negotiable. "A coworker came to talk to me today," he admitted. "She made it clear that she's interested." Sandra's stomach dropped. "And you?" "I told her I needed to think, but only because she left before I could say no." He spoke quickly, his hands finding her shoulders. "Sandra, there's nothing to think about, but she's a colleague. I don't want to hurt someone unnecessarily." Sandra took a steady breath. "You can't control her feelings. You can only be honest about yours." "I know. I'll make it clear tomorrow that," he paused, his voice softening, "that my heart already belongs to someone. If you still want me." Sandra exhaled sharply. "If I want you?" "Yes. Conrad, I spent a month looking for you on the subway. I think the answer's pretty obvious." He smiled, finally relaxing. "I just wanted to hear you say it." "My heart has an owner, too," Sandra murmured. "A stubborn cardiologist who somehow makes me feel like I've stopped tripping over my own feet." Conrad pulled her closer, and the world around them began to fade. The streets of New York, the distant hum of traffic, the glow of building lights, until there was only them, standing beneath a street lamp casting soft shadows across his face. He lifted a hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw as if memorizing it, as if saving the moment for every hard day to come. Sandra felt her heartbeat race, the air thinning around them, and when his eyes met hers, those eyes that had been so tired on the subway and now shone with something she couldn't name but fully recognized. She knew this wouldn't be just another kiss. It would be a promise. Conrad leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but she didn't want to. She rose onto her toes, closing the small distance between them, and when his lips finally met hers, the world stopped. It wasn't a rushed or casual kiss like the others. It was slow, deliberate, built on 3 months of careful construction and shared vulnerability. It was every 3 a.m. conversation, every stolen glance at the cafe, every time he'd shown up just to see her for 10 minutes between surgeries. It was the month she had spent searching for him on the subway, the stubborn hope that refused to die, the moment he walked into Clover and Steam and changed everything. Conrad's fingers slid from her jaw to the back of her neck, threading through her hair, pulling her closer as if the distance between them were both physical and emotional torture. Sandra clutched his coat, the damn gray coat she'd searched for in subway cars like it was a beacon, and melted into him, against him, with him. When they finally pulled apart, it was only enough to breathe. Their foreheads rested together, eyes still closed, hearts beating out of sync yet perfectly aligned. Conrad let out a low, disbelieving laugh, and Sandra felt the vibration against her lips. "I don't want this night to end," he confessed, his voice rough, honest, stripped of all defenses. Sandra opened her eyes, finding his only inches away. "Then don't let it," she whispered, and saw the exact moment he understood the invitation. He kissed her again, shorter but no less intense, then took her hand, their fingers intertwining as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. Maybe all of it. The spilled coffee, the failed searches, The impossible reappearance at the cafe had simply been the universe's way of putting two broken pieces back together until they fit perfectly. Conrad woke to sunlight, and Sandra curled against him like a cat. They hadn't done anything more than talk late into the night, eventually falling asleep fully clothed, tangled together. But there was an intimacy in that which went far beyond the physical. "Are you watching me sleep?" she mumbled without opening her eyes. "That's kind of creepy. Or romantic. Devastating," he said when she asked how she looked. "Liar. I sleep like a troll. A very charming troll." Eventually, reality won out. Conrad said goodbye, promising to call as soon as he'd spoken to Tassi. "Be kind," Sandra asked, "but be clear. I promise." He found Tassi in the break room during their shift. "Can we talk?" She knew immediately. "You're going to say no." "Tassi, you're incredible, but I'm already with someone." She nodded, taking a sip of coffee. "Is it serious?" "It's starting to be. Does she know how lucky she is?" Conrad smiled, a little sadly. "I think I'm the lucky one." Tassi said nothing for a while, then sighed. "All right, just give me some time, okay? As much as you need." She walked out, and Conrad felt both relieved and guilty. He had done the right thing. He knew he had. Glenn appeared seconds later. "Heard Tassi gave you some kind of romantic ultimatum. News travels fast." "It's a hospital," Glenn said, pouring himself coffee. "I'm assuming you said no." "Yes, because of Sandra." Glenn studied his friend for a moment. "You've been different since you met her, less gray. It's good to see." Conrad felt something tighten in his chest. "I was so lost, Glenn. I thought I'd forgotten how to be a person outside of this place." "And she reminded you?" "She reminded me that it's okay to stumble." Glenn clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Then don't screw this up, Foster." "I won't." But if Conrad thought he had everything under control, the universe had other plans. 2 weeks later, Sandra was closing the cafe when her phone rang. Unknown number. "Sandra, this is Tassi. I work with Conrad." Sandra's stomach dropped. "Hi. I'll be direct. Conrad has a pattern. He gets involved fast, and when things get too real, he pulls back. It happened with Vanessa. It will happen with you." Sandra felt anger rising. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I care about him, and I think you should know. Or maybe you're just hurt because he chose someone else." Silence. "Think what you want. But when he cancels plans because of a surgery, when you realize you'll always come second, remember that I warned you." The call ended. Sandra stood there, heart pounding. She knew it was manipulation, but the words had already found her insecurities and settled in like poison. She stared at the phone for a long moment before instinctively dialing Marin. "San, what happened?" "You never call at this hour." Marin's worried voice came through. "His co-worker, Tassi, she called me." "And?" Sandra explained everything, the words tumbling out in a messy rush. When she finished, there was silence on the other end. "San, breathe," Marin said firmly. "You're listening to a rejected woman trying to plant doubt. This is basic manipulation. But what if she's right? What if— Stop right now." Marin's tone sharpened. "You're doing it again. That thing where you create problems before they exist. Remember what I told you? Don't ruin this one." "But Marin, he cancels plans, disappears for days. Because he's a doctor, Sandra. He saves lives. Not because he's pulling away from you." Marin sighed. "Look, you promised you'd let this happen. That you'd trust. So trust. Talk to him. Not the jealous co-worker. Him." Sandra felt a cold wave move through her stomach. "And what if I lose him?" "You'll only lose him if you keep acting like you already have. You get that? You're creating the very prophecy you're afraid will come true." "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been. You were just too busy chasing people on the subway to notice." Marin paused. "San, I saw you with him. I saw the way he looks at you. That man isn't pulling away. But if you push him away out of fear, he might not have a choice." Sandra wiped her tears. "What do I do?" "You go home, you sleep. Tomorrow, when you're thinking clearly, you talk to him. Honestly. No accusations. Just talk. Okay?" "Okay. Promise?" "I promise." "Good. Now hang up and take care of yourself. And San, I believe in you too. So try to believe it too." The call ended, and Sandra stood there in the empty cafe, Marin's words echoing in her head. She Was right. Of course she was. But over the next few days, even knowing that, Sandra started to notice things. Conrad canceled dinner because of an emergency surgery. Rational, understandable. But Tassi's voice echoed in her mind. You'll always come second. 3 days went by without seeing each other. Only rushed text messages. The words lingered. He disappears into work. That was when Marin showed up unannounced at Sandra's apartment, armed with ice cream and a look of fierce determination. Okay, enough, she said, barging in. You've been spiraling alone in here for 3 days. Intervention time. I'm not spiraling. You're eating cereal straight from the box at 2 in the afternoon. That's literally the definition of spiraling. Marin sat on the couch and motioned for Sandra to do the same. Look, I get it. You're scared. But San, are you really going to ruin this because some rejected woman decided to poison your head? What if she's right? What if she's wrong? What if you throw away something real because you're too scared to trust it? Marin took her friend's hands. Talk to him. Now. Today. Before this turns into something bigger than it is. Sandra knew Marin was right. But knowing and doing were two different things. Until they weren't anymore. The explosion came on a cold night. Conrad showed up with Thai food and that tired smile of his. But Sandra was tense. Different. What's going on? He asked after half an nothing. Sandra. And then it happened. Tassi called me. She said you have a pattern. That you pull back when things get real. That I'll always come second. Conrad's expression hardened instantly. And you believed her? I don't know. You cancel, you disappear, and I know it's work, but what if she's right? Stop, Conrad cut in. Stop putting words in my mouth and fears in my head. I'm just being realistic. You're being a coward, he shot back. Sandra froze, wide-eyed. Sorry, Conrad said quickly, pulling back. But Sandra, you're creating problems that don't exist because you're scared. I'm terrified too, but we can't build anything if you're already planning the fall. Then tell me she's wrong. Conrad stayed silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Better yet, I'll make it perfectly clear to her. Conrad, what are you? He was already dialing. He put it on speaker and set the phone down. On the table between them. Tassi answered on the third ring. Conrad, is everything okay? It's almost 10. No, Tassi, it's not okay. His voice was firm, controlled, but there was a hard edge in it that Sandra had never heard before. You called Sandra. There was a pause on the other end. I thought she deserved to know. You thought you should sabotage my relationship because I didn't want to be with you. Conrad interrupted. Let me be very clear, and I need you to hear every word. I love Sandra. I'm not with her out of convenience or because she happened to be there. I'm with her because she reminds me that there's life outside the hospital. Because she makes me laugh when I forget how. Because when I'm with her, I don't just feel functional, I feel alive. Sandra felt her eyes sting, but these tears were different. Conrad, I was only trying. You were trying to plant doubt. You were trying to destroy something good because you were hurt. And I get it, Tassi. I understand rejection hurts, but what you did crossed every professional and personal line. He paused, his jaw tight. So I'll say this once, and only once. Stop trying to damage my relationship. Sandra is not a second choice. She's not temporary. She's the person I choose every single day, and nothing you say will change that. The silence on the other end was heavy. I'm sorry, Tassi finally said, her voice small. So am I, Conrad replied, softer now. I'm sorry it came to this, but I won't let it go on. I hope you can move forward, truly, but away from us. He hung up before she could answer. The room fell silent. Conrad looked at Sandra, who stood motionless, tears streaming down her face. You said you love me. Conrad blinked as if only now realizing what he'd said. Then a slow smile formed. I did, and it's true. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. He closed the distance between them, his hands cupping her face, thumbs, brushing away her tears. You mean too much to me, and I'm not going to let anyone make you doubt that. Sandra let out something between a laugh and a sob. I love you too. So much it's terrifying. I know, Conrad murmured, pressing his forehead against hers. But you're not going to lose me, not like this. The only way you lose me is if you tell me to go. I don't want to do that. Then don't. They stood there for a long moment, breathing together until Sandra finally nodded. "Okay, I trust you. And I trust you," he said before kissing her. It was different this time, filled with spoken promises, open declarations, conscious choices. It was no longer just attraction or possibility. It was commitment. It was love admitted aloud, defended and protected. Because love wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to stay, to fight, to protect, in spite of it. The next day, Sandra texted Marin. "He told that crazy Tassi he loves me." He called her. It was perfect. The reply came instantly. "Finally, now stop being an idiot and go be happy, that's an order." Sandra smiled, slipping her phone away. Order received. Clover and Steam had changed over the past 2 years. Not drastically. It was still the same cozy haven in the heart of New York. With its exposed brick walls and the hanging plants Sandra insisted on rescuing. But there were subtle differences. A new espresso machine, after the old one finally gave up on life. Framed prints on the walls that Conrad had picked out at an antique fair, and a small bookshelf where customers could borrow and return books whenever they pleased. And, of course, there was the ring. Sandra glanced at her hand as she made a cappuccino, the simple but beautiful diamond catching the morning light. She still caught herself smiling whenever she saw it. 6 months into the engagement, and she still wasn't quite used to the comforting weight of it. The proposal had been perfectly Conrad. No grand production, no flash mob, no hidden cameras. Just the two of them, sitting on a bench in Central Park on an autumn afternoon, golden leaves falling all around as he held her hand and told her, with that raw sincerity she adored, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life stumbling beside her. Sandra had cried, obviously. Then she laughed, realizing there was coffee on his coat sleeve. Some things never changed. "You've got that lovesick look again," Marin said as she passed by carrying a tray of fresh croissants. "I do not. You do. You stare at the ring like it's about to reveal a secret message. Maybe it will. You never know." Marin rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. She'd been the first person Sandra called after saying yes, and had screamed so loudly over the phone that she scared the neighbor's cat 3 floors down. The cafe door opened, bringing in a gust of cold air and a tall man in a gray coat who made Sandra's heart race every single time, without fail. "Dr. Foster," Sandra said formally, though her eyes gave her away. "The usual?" "That depends," Conrad replied, leaning against the counter with that smile that still managed to undo her from the inside out. "Does the usual include the barista giving me her undivided attention for 5 minutes?" "That can be arranged." "Good, because I have a proposal." Sandra arched an eyebrow, intrigued. Conrad pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and placed it on the counter between them. "What's this?" "Open it." Sandra wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the envelope, feeling something stiff inside. When she opened it, she found 2 plane tickets. "Italy," she read, eyes wide. "Conrad, this is a pre-honeymoon," he interrupted. 2 weeks. Just us. I thought we could visit the birthplace of that risotto you swore changed your life." Sandra felt tears prick at her eyes. She had become a crybaby since the engagement, something Marin loved to point out. "But the wedding isn't for another 4 months." "I know, but I managed to get 2 weeks off, which is basically a medical miracle, and I don't want to wait 4 more months to have you all to myself in a city where no one can interrupt us." "You're incredible," Sandra said, already smiling so wide it hurt. "Irresistible? Unbearably romantic. I'll take it." Marin appeared out of nowhere, snatching the tickets from Sandra's hand to inspect them. "Italy, 2 weeks. San, you're going, I'll handle everything here." "Marin, I can't just leave you alone for—" "You can and you will," Marin cut in, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Besides, I hired a temporary assistant. Everything's covered." Sandra looked between her best friend and her fiancé, suspicious. "You two planned this together." "Obviously," they said in unison. And so, a few weeks later, Sandra found herself walking hand in hand with Conrad through the narrow streets of Rome, eating gelato that dripped down their fingers, laughing at their failed attempts to speak Italian, and falling in love all over again, with the city, and with the man beside her. It was in Florence on an old bridge over the Arno River that Conrad pulled her close and whispered that he wanted this forever, her, him, and life surprising them. Sandra replied that he'd have to put up with spilled coffee for the rest of his life, and, Conrad said, especially because of that. In that moment, with the Tuscan sun warming their faces and the river flowing beneath them, Sandra knew with absolute certainty that she had found exactly what she had always been searching for. The following months passed in a blur. There were dresses to choose, invitations to send, heated debates over guest lists that ended in laughter and kisses. Glenn insisted on giving the best man's speech, which both Sandra and Conrad knew would be wildly inappropriate. Maren cried when she was asked to be maid of honor, then pretended it was just allergies. When the day finally arrived on a golden late summer afternoon, Sandra stood in the garden of a rented countryside house, surrounded by 50 people who truly mattered. She wore a simple yet elegant dress with flowers in her hair that Maren had arranged herself, and when she started walking toward Conrad, she saw that look, the one that made her feel like he was seeing something sacred, something he would never grow tired of admiring. The vows were written by them. Sandra promised to try not to spill things on him, but with no guarantees. Conrad promised to always laugh at her clumsy disasters. Both promised to choose each other every single day, especially on the hard ones. There was no grand pomp or cinematic production, but there was love. So much love that it seemed to overflow from every corner of that garden, bathed in fairy lights and the last glow of daylight. When the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," Conrad dipped her dramatically, making the small crowd burst into applause, and Sandra laughed against his lips, thinking that yes, this was exactly how it was supposed to be. Glenn gave a speech that started touching and ended with a joke about cardiologists that made half the guests groan and the other half laugh. Maren spoke about friendship, about watching Sandra finally find someone who loved her exactly as she was. And at the end of the night, when the guests were gone and the newlyweds stood alone under the stars, Conrad pulled Sandra into one last dance without music, just the two of them swaying slowly as the rest of the world disappeared. Married life began surprisingly smoothly. They moved into a small house in Brooklyn, full of plants and deliberately crooked frames, and that kind of organized mess that comes from two people living completely intertwined. Sandra kept working at Clover and Steam, but now as co-owner. She and Maren had bought the place a few months after the wedding, fulfilling a dream neither of them had realized they'd had. Conrad had reduced his hospital hours after accepting a partially administrative position, something Glenn called the sanest decision you've ever made. The first years were a dance of discoveries. They discovered that Conrad was a terrible cook but an excellent restaurant picker, that Sandra sang in the shower and wasn't remotely embarrassed about it, that Sunday mornings were sacred and no one, not medical emergencies nor broken coffee machines, was allowed to interrupt. They were happy in that quiet, deep way that comes from choosing the same person over and over again, even when it's hard. It was on a lazy Saturday morning, almost 2 years after the wedding, that Sandra was attempting to make pancakes and failing spectacularly when she felt arms wrap around her waist from behind. Conrad turned off the stove, before the kitchen could catch fire, turned her to face him, kissed the tip of her nose, and declared that thank God they had cereal. They curled up on the couch with their bowls, their bodies naturally fitting together, and that was when Sandra shared the thought she'd been carrying for weeks. She talked about expansion, not of the cafe, but of the family, about babies, little humans who might inherit her tendency for chaos and his medical perfectionism. Conrad didn't answer right away. He just looked at her with that intensity that still made her stomach flip, then smiled, that wide, genuine smile that lit up his whole face, and said he wanted all of it with her. Babies, chaos, sleepless nights, burnt pancakes, everything. The following months were a blur of excitement and nerves. Doctor appointments, pregnancy books stacked on the nightstand, 3 a.m. conversations about fears and hopes, and then, one spring morning, 2 pink lines changed everything. Sandra cried. Conrad cried. Maren cried when she found out. The pregnancy was exactly what Sandra expected. Chaotic. She had morning sickness that lasted all day, strange cravings for impossible food combinations, and an uncanny ability to cry over toilet paper commercials. Conrad was in full protector mode, adorable, sometimes suffocating, but Sandra loved every second of it. He talked to her belly every night, telling stories about his day, making promises about the kind of father he would be. And when little Lauren finally arrived, after 12 hours of labor that tested every ounce of Sandra's patience, the world stopped. Conrad held his daughter for the first time with a mix of awe and pure terror, and Sandra, exhausted and sweaty and completely in love, knew that yes, it had all been worth it. The first months with Lauren were a blur of diapers, sleepless nights, and a love so intense it scared them both. Clover and Steam gained a new regular customer, a 6-month-old baby with huge, curious eyes she had definitely inherited from her father, sitting in Conrad's lap as he tried to drink coffee with one hand and hold her with the other. Maren became the favorite aunt, the one who showed up with gifts and scooped Lauren up whenever Sandra needed 10 minutes of peace. Glenn stopped by every week just to make faces at the baby and comment that she had her mother's lungs and her father's dramatic timing. The years that followed were a succession of firsts. Lauren's first steps, straight into Conrad's arms while Sandra filmed and cried at the same time. Her first word, Dada, which Sandra pretended not to be jealous of. Her first day of daycare, which was harder on the parents than on the child. And then came Thomas. Tommy completing the family in an unexpected but perfectly welcome way. If Lauren was curious and observant like her father, Tommy was pure, chaotic energy like his mother. The little Brooklyn house that had grown, cramped, was replaced by a larger one in Queens, with a backyard where the kids could run, and Sandra could grow her garden. On an ordinary Sunday afternoon when Lauren was 6 and Tommy 2, Sandra was in the kitchen making cookies, which really meant flour on every imaginable surface, while Conrad chased Tommy around the yard in a game of tag that looked more like boot camp. Lauren stood beside her mother dropping chocolate chips, half into the bowl, half onto the floor, and when Sandra looked out the window and saw Conrad, grass-stained and laughing as Tommy tried to climb him like a mountain, her chest tightened in that wonderful familiar way. That man, the one she'd once spilled coffee on in the subway, was now out there being the most loving, present father she could have ever imagined. And she, covered in flour with a daughter who had inherited her talent for culinary disasters, wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. That night, after the kids finally fell asleep, a process that involved 3 bedtime stories, 2 glasses of water, and diplomatic negotiations about monsters under the bed, Sandra and Conrad collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but content. Conrad murmured something about surviving another day, and Sandra laughed, saying it was only 18 more years until college. He asked if she regretted anything, and Sandra said she only regretted not spilling that coffee on him sooner. Conrad smiled, pulling her closer, and said it was the best shirt he'd ever lost. They stayed there in the comfortable silence of a house finally quiet, toys scattered across the floor, dishes in the sink, but hearts completely full. Sandra thought about how life had unfolded, from a 26-year-old woman carrying a fern on the subway to this, 35, looking at the photos on the wall of the family she'd helped build. It hadn't been the grand cinematic romance she'd once imagined when she was young. There was no dramatic background music, no declarations in the rain. It was better. It was spilled coffee and rescued plants, sleepless nights and chaotic mornings, choosing each other every day, even and especially when it was hard. It was real, messy, imperfect, and absolutely, unquestionably true. Sandra Holly Foster was 26 when she collided with a stranger on the subway and changed her life forever. Now, at 35, watching her husband sleep on the couch beside her, she smiled. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive at convenient times or in expected forms. Sometimes it comes with spilled coffee, delays, and second chances that insist on returning on the same line. And sometimes, if you're lucky, truly lucky, it stays. Forever. The subway had moved on that day, but her heart had stayed behind, and finally found the place it had always belonged. So, what would you do if the love of your life appeared in the subway, right in the middle of your worst day? This was Sandra and Conrad's journey, a story about second chances, hope, and the kind of love that heals even the most tired heart. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell, and tell us in the comments what moved you the most. Your comment and your hype help the channel grow and bring more intense and heartfelt love stories to the world.